all set if I get started in a minute or so? Are you all set if I get started in a minute? Okay.
I'll just move away my stuff here.
Okay.
I have like a storage that I'm carrying around.
Let's see if I get this. Good afternoon, everyone. We are going to go ahead and get started. My name is Michael Kugelman. I'm the Senior Associate for South Asia with the Asia program here at the Wilson Center. And right away, before I forget, I would just like to thank our institutional co-sponsor, the Wilson Center's Global Women's Leadership Initiative. Thank you very much for your assistance with this event. It always brings me and always brings us great pleasure to have events such as today's, when the Wilson Center can spotlight the great work that's done by its Pakistan scholars. And today the focus will be on Fouzia Saeed, who is our 2014-2015 Pakistan scholar. Many of you know who she is and what she's done very briefly. You've got a bio in front of you. I won't dwell on it. But she is essential. Well, she's many things. She's an activist. She's a scholar. Earlier this year, as many of you would know, particularly those of you that may read the Pakistani press, she received a very prestigious appointment, appointed by the Prime Minister of Pakistan as the Executive Director of Lok Virsa, which is the Pakistan National Institute for Folk and Traditional Heritage. And I'll let you read the bio to get other information about her. Fouzia is the 11th Pakistan scholar that we've had at the Wilson Center. We've also had journalists, former diplomats, business people, academics. This Pakistan Scholar Program, along with just about all of the Wilson Center's work on Pakistan, could not exist without the generous support of the Fellowship Fund for Pakistan. And I'd like to express my appreciation and gratitude for the Fellowship Fund for Pakistan for all of its support. As many of you know, Fouzia is working on a project that examines 4 different movements, grassroots movements in Pakistan involving women's activism that has produced changes in policies, laws, and institutions. I think this is a very important study for a number of reasons. I identified 2. One of them is that it really defies a very large stereotype that in Pakistan the story of women is one of repression and passivity. This is, of course, a very incomplete and distorted picture, and Fouzia's research shows why. Second reason why her study is so significant is that it highlights the activism of women in Pakistan who largely operate outside of the spotlight. There has been plenty of media coverage of the admirable work being done by very prominent women in Pakistan, women such as Asma Jehangir, human rights activist, and the rights and arts advocate Sabine Mahmood, who, as many of you know, was tragically killed in a few days ago. Much less, though, is said about these women's movements that are being led outside of the spotlight and behind the scenes. So Fouzia will be bringing these stories to life. So with that, I'll stop talking now and let her tell you all about her research. And after she speaks, we'll have sufficient time for a question and answer.
Okay, thank you very much. Really happy to be sharing my work with colleagues and friends. And for me, the challenge is to squeeze it down to a palatable presentation size, because I'm a bit overwhelmed with the kind of information that I found and the kind of documentation I've done. So I will start with my presentation. Very quick socio-political overview. For some of you, I know that most of you are very familiar with Pakistan, but very brief kind of overview. Pakistan got its independence from British colonial rule in 1947. We have had a checkered kind of a political scenario where almost half the time the military was ruling and half the time, I would say, non-military rule, mostly democratic, but also there were times when there was undemocratic non-military rule. So the first 10 years of the country were very like Grand Rapids, very like a turmoil. Because the founder of the country, the person who was leading the freedom movement, died after the first year. and therefore the first period is not very stable. And then we stepped into a 10-year-long military rule. So that kind of took us off the track. Even though the right of vote was inherited by us, but the first proper adult franchise election took place in 1970. So it was almost like after 20 years of our freedom, we got a proper election. But unfortunately, the results of the election, we had one side of Pakistan where 4 provinces were amalgamated into one called West Pakistan, and then another part of Pakistan across India, which was called East Pakistan, and both had different parties win the election. And the complications and tensions ended up separating the 2 parts and East Pakistan becoming Bangladesh. And I think that I'm simplifying this complex historic incident to a criminal level, but just to kind of make a few comments, I will say that. And then we had democratic rule for a while, and again we stepped into a military rule, which was really the darkest years in 11 years, very dark period, which was anti-people, anti-fundamental rights, anti-women, anti-non-Muslims, anti-political people, etc. And when we came out of that for 1 decade, which was 90s, for 1 decade, it was like a musical chairs of democratic parties, very weak democracies, 2 big parties. And by that time, the constitution, which I must mention, that there were attempts of making a constitution, but it was not until 1973 that we had a proper constitution. And that got skewed so much by different military dictators that that when the democracy returned, the president had the powers to pull the plug and dissolve any assembly, and therefore the 90s were quite chaotic also. Again, we stepped into a military dictatorship for about 8 years, and then it was really in 2008 that Pakistan went back on the democratic track, and we have had 2 consecutive elected governments since then. So that was a very, very quick, my attempt of 2-minute political background. Now, in this context, I mentioned all this because one has to see that Pakistani people have been victimized by military dictatorships or repressive regimes. They have been struggling, they have been activists, they have been fighting for their rights. So there have been periods where different layers of society have been doing different things at different times. So in that context, I want to talk about women's movements. And my study, like Michael said, challenges the perception that women are only victims of repressive regimes and patriarchal systems. It also documents the collective action. My objective was really when and how women organize and what have they done when they organize. And so collective action is what I wanted to document, and we have hardly had any proper documentation of our own social movements. Now, I draw up from different scholars, a lot of scholars, but I specifically want to mention these. Friedrich Hayek, because of his ideas that when people have problems and they have solutions, that information is not embodied in one person, but is scattered in little bits and pieces with a lot of people. And that is how collective action takes place, because a lot of people bring in their perspectives and join together. Eleanor Ostrom develops that idea much more, and she has done her work in collective action, how groups kind of building blocks and successes build on each other, and how rules shape their actions, and especially informal rules and hierarchies that are embedded in how people relate to each other, and how incentives and punishments then shape their direction of where they want to go. Jack Goldstone, I'm happy he's here also, his work on agency, collective action, and also about revolutions, analyzing revolutions, and I would say also his insights how relationships between groups and how specific circumstances of where people are operating, that really makes a difference in how they form their direction and move towards collective action. And Donatella Della Porta's work on social movements and also her in-depth analysis of characteristics of social movements and dynamics and classifications. So in addition, many other scholars inform my work. I have taken 4 women's movements, and I would say that my definition of women's movements is a bit loose. It's not very strict, where I'm looking at movements that were led by women, and also where women played a very strong and significant role, not necessarily on gender issues. You know, I differ from how probably in feminist literature they would define women's movement. So it can be for any purpose where women collect. And also I kind of carved out my sample from the last 15 years, because I wanted to see what has happened recently. So I have selected these 4 movements because these were not movements that were brewing up, but they have kind of gone along some way, and they have found at least partial resolve. And also these movements, one of the criteria was that these movements have shown concrete achievements. So that is how I selected the 4. And I will quickly describe the movements. I wish I could go into the detailed dynamics, but I would describe the movements briefly, give you glimpses of that, and then I will, in the latter part of my presentation, I would go into the collective lessons that I'm drawing out of it. So the first one is fisherfolk movement. Now this is a movement that was led by communities that are into fishing business. And they line the southern coastal areas of Pakistan, and they are across 2 provinces. And these are indigenous people who have done this work for hundreds of years. And the movement, the core issue was right of indigenous people to the water and to fishing. And therefore, they were very grieved about the over-commercialization. Big companies with big fishing trawlers who were allowed to come very close to the coast. They were allowed to use nets with very small holes. And then land mafia that was allowed to cut the mangrove forests where the fish breed, pollution, those kinds of issues that really were bothering them a lot. But most of all, I think their grievance was that their land were being taken over by very powerful landowners illegally, and also rangers who are paramilitary force on the pretext that they are close to the border. They were taken over illegally, and they were kind of forced to be in a contract situation where these people had to sell the fish only to the contractors, illegal contractors. So now I want to talk a little bit about women. Women have been very actively engaged in the fishing activities. More recently, they have been pushed back into their homes because of several reasons. I'm not going into that. But they are a party to it, and this was directly taking away their livelihood. They're already extremely poor people, so it was affecting their lives. Now, women joined in quite early in the movement, first because of the issues. Secondly, because when the men took initiative, the reaction from the administration was taking away the men, taking away their children, and they reacted to this reaction. And they said, when it's about our family, then we have to come out and be active. So they were very active in all that respect. Now, at one point, it started in about 2000, year 2000, a little earlier than that. And the climax was year 2004, around that time, when they actually, after a lot of struggle, they got rid of the contract system. They still are struggling with other weeds that they are wading through, but they still got the big hump of their grievance out. Now, women felt that when it was about their dignity, especially in areas where rangers had taken over, they felt like they could the rangers could just enter the home anytime, and because they were not allowed to take the fish even for their food, the rangers would kick their pots and felt like whoever was eating fish was a thief, because they must have hid it somewhere, and they would ask women to wash their clothes, they would harass women a lot. So I think that was also another turning point for women. But when women picked up issues that were directly related to them, like one woman who refused to comply with constant sexual harassment attempts. She refused, and she was picked up and gang raped for three months. All the women protested in the streets for 3 months, but they felt like the way they always supported their men, the men did not support them. So that kind of initiated another thought process, and they felt like they needed to maybe look for another platform. Now, I would do, very quickly, I would try and give you a glimpse. These are very short clips, but just so that you can touch the movement a little bit. Oops. Blue flags were their mark, because of water. He's sort of the main leader of the women.
मारुवड़न जी मिठड़ी बोली रहे सदा सिंधु जी छोली मारुवड़न जी मिठड़ी बोली गली गली ऐं घर घर गूंजन सिंधु अमर जा नारा 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 जिए सिंधु वारा जियन
Mostly it is Sindhi. That's very important. Okay, so I'll switch to the next movement, which is the movement of landless peasants. Now this was in the central Punjab area, mostly lands. This was, the tradition is old from the colonial times when British used to give big pieces of land to big landowners, or they actually became landowners, and they would hire people to cultivate the lands, and in return they would give the Britishers horses. Certain number of horses. So that continued after the independence of Pakistan also, and even though the government was the owner, they gave lands to big landowners, and they would then in turn keep these farmers on a 50-50 sharecropping arrangement. But because in the beginning there was not enough crop, and later they became, the managers became very corrupt. These were, some of them were government departments, some of them were landowners. They became very corrupt and they were cheating the farmers. So that grievance, it kept on going, and the momentum built up. With that, there was a lot of humiliation involved and issues of dignity involved, because they would beat them up. Anybody who would protest against the corruption, etc., would get bashing. Now, women joined together. This is also, it was initiated by men. Women joined together with men really early on. Firstly, because it was about their livelihoods and it was about their dignity. And secondly, because the initial reaction from the government and from the administration was pick up their guys, pick up their children, throw them in the jail on fake cases. And that is when the women really came out. And when the women came out, they used a weapon, which is a stick that they have at homes, and it is used to wash their clothes. In Punjabi, it is called thapa, and they call themselves a thapa force. And so they would come out in thousands and they would beat up the rangers, because one part of these farms was taken over by rangers, and they would beat up military people, they would beat the police, break the police stations. I mean, they would just go like locusts in thousands, and they would flatten the police station. It was to that extent. Women also, there was one time when they really took the whole leadership, male leadership in the lockups in jail, and women then took over the movement. So for 5 years, the president of this movement of the whole of Punjab, which had these kinds of farms in 10 districts, was led by, the president was a woman. And then some of the key position holders in the executive were women. So they turned out to be a lot better negotiators. Whereas men were confronting, and it was easier for the administration to just pick up men and go. They were a bit hesitant. They were not sure how to deal with women, and women were better negotiators. So again, a very short glimpse so that you get an idea of the kind of population we are talking about. Extremely poor people. But let me just add here that their issue was, these were indigenous people, and their issue was right to own the land. That was one, and the second was the dignity, because they were humiliated constantly and abused constantly, especially by the paramilitary force rangers who illegally claimed the land for themselves. So there were times when they refused to share the crop and refused to let the police or the administration come in to pick the crop from their fields. And for 3-4 years, the tension was so high that the military had to encircle these villages with heavy ammunition, and they stopped all the communication, their electricity, their water, their irrigation water for almost like a 2-month period. And it was a mega chaos in the country because of that. However, they survived that, and they put their foot down, and they said, we will not let you share the crop. And eventually, the administration backed off, because the solidarity generated locally and internationally at one point was so high that the government was embarrassed to do that. And they did back off, and in a very dignified way, they tried to resolve it and give. Some communities got the land back. Okay.
असां मंगदे नहीं खैरात, असां मंगदे नहीं खैरात, तेरा कुबा साडा है, किती मेहनत है दिन रात, भाई किती मेहनत।
करना दी मैं जाके बाह फड़ लई सी, इत्थे फुर लगा सी सज्जे पासे। मैं किवें शेर आंदा अम्मा असीं आया गूठे लवाण, ते गूठे काहदे लवाना ठेके लाना। मैं आख्या ठेका को नहीं, अज भी साडी ते कल भी साडी, ते तू फुट्टा खा, तू फौज दा जनरल है ते मैं पैरी नहीं कमा लगा, मैं डरदी नहीं।
ਉਹਨਾਂ ਦਾ ਜਿਹੜਾ ਹੱਥ ਦਾ ਇਸਤੇਮਾਲ ਹੋਣ ਵਾਲਾ ਹਥਿਆਰ ਹੈ ਉਹ ਹੈ ਹੀ ਹੈ, ਤੇ ਉਹਨਾਂ ਨੇ ਉਹੀ ਆਪਣਾ ਹਥਿਆਰ ਚੁੱਕਿਆ ਔਰ ਨਿਕਲ ਪਈਆਂ। ਔਰ ਦੂਸਰਾ ਜਿਹੜਾ ਹੈ ਕਿ ਇੱਕ ਸਫਾਈ ਦਾ ਇਹਦੇ ਵਿੱਚ ਸ਼ਾਮਿਲ ਹੈਗਾ, ਜਿਵੇਂ ਕੱਪੜਿਆਂ ਦੀ ਮੈਲ ਕੱਢੀ ਜਾਂਦੀ ਹੈ, ਐਸੇ ਤਰ੍ਹਾਂ ਹੀ ਉਹਨਾਂ ਨੇ ਸਾਰੀ ਇੰਤਜ਼ਾਮੀਆਂ ਦਾ ਤੇ ਮਿਲਟਰੀ ਦਾ ਜਿਹੜਾ ਗੰਦ ਹੈ ਉਹਨੂੰ ਵੀ ਉਸ ਥਾਪੇ ਨਾਲ ਸਾਫ਼ ਕੀਤਾ।
ਜਦੋਂ ਔਰਤਾਂ ਟੁਰੀਆਂ ਉਦੋਂ ਅੰਗੂਠੇ ਲੱਗੇ ਸੀ, ਪਟੇਨਾਮੇ ਤੇ ਉਹਨਾਂ ਅੰਗੂਠੇ ਲਵਾਏ ਸੀ। ਉਦੋਂ ਔਰਤਾਂ ਫਿਰ ਮੀਟਿੰਗਾਂ ਕੀਤੀਆਂ ਸਾਰੇ ਚੱਕਾਂ ਦੇ ਵਿੱਚ ਜਾ ਕੇ। ਸਕੂਲ ਬੰਦ ਕਰ ਲਿਆ ਉਹਨਾਂ, ਨਹਿਰੀ ਪਾਣੀ ਬੰਦ ਹੋ ਗਿਆ, ਬਿਜਲੀਆਂ ਬੰਦ ਕਰ ਲਈਆਂ, ਟੈਲੀਫੋਨ ਬੰद हो गए, शहरों से जाना बड़ा सान मुश्किल हो गया।
जिसने पूरे पंजाब में किसानों को मुतहर्रिक कर दिया और उन्होंने मालकी या मौत के नारे से इस जालिमाना निज़ाम के खिलाफ सुर्ख झंडा लहरा दिया। एक में जब फौज, रेंजर्स और पुलिस के तशद्दुद ने मर्दों को पसपा होने पर मजबूर किया, तो औरतों ने कदम आगे बढ़ाया। फौज, रेंजर्स और पुलिस के सामने ना सिर्फ डट गईं, बल्कि इन्हें भागने पर मजबूर कर दिया।
That woman was saying that we use that stick to get the dirt out of the clothes. We wanted to use the same stick to get the dirt out of these corrupt institutions and police and rangers. Okay, so now I will switch to the next movement, which is the Women Health Workers Movement. And this was actually a development project that was started by Benazir Bhutto in 1994. And through this project, about 100,000 women were hired to reach out to neglected communities that have been out of the ambit of health services. So their job was to reach out to these slum women and rural women, remote women, in terms of health-related issues of women and children. So here in the western part of the world, they are known as polio workers, or at least that aspect of their work is more familiar. So they, after years, usually when you start a project, then it takes about a year for the government to absorb it as regular part of the program. But almost up till today, which is like 20 years, they have not been absorbed as regular workers. And their thing was that if we are not regular workers, we don't have that respect. We don't even have a room to sit in, and people treat us, our bosses treat us that, as if, we are disposable paper. And not with respect. So they got together, and their salaries were very low, but the main issue was of dignity. The salaries were very low. At that time, the health workers were earning like about $12 a month, roughly, and $30 a month. And even that seemed to be incentive enough for them to continue, but they were very closely attached to the kind of work they were doing. When they came out, the resistance from the administration was immense. A lot of violence. They faced water hosing, beating, because I will discuss that later, how administration frames the issue. But they wanted to become regularized, and because they were spread out all over the country, the ambit of this movement was all over the country, and they organized themselves through provinces, and health centers used to be their hub. So that movement continued. It started in 2008. So that is when Pakistan kind of came back on the democratic path. It started at that time, and it went on where they found their biggest help was this institution, Supreme Court, which took suo motu action twice. And then they also did kind of follow-up. So the case went on for 2 years, and at least these women, through a lot of protests and also lobbying with the judiciary, they were able to raise their salaries to the minimum wage, which was the legal wage in the country. And currently they have about $130 a month. So that was a big jump, but it is still a sort of basic pay for all of them, the supervisors as well as the health workers. Again, here they made allies with the media, but mostly with judiciary, a little bit with politicians, and up till now, 3 provinces have committed. They have legislation to regularize them. 1 province has not committed yet. They're still working on it, and their salary is still not regularly paid to them. Let me just give you, this is a very short glimpse. Okay, there were a lot of broken bones and broken heads in that movement, a lot of violence. Now, the 4th movement is called the Asha movement. This was an alliance against sexual harassment, and some of you who attended my last year's presentation, Asha was there was a film about Asha movement. This was the main issue, the core issue was sexual harassment. Early on, it was the working women who stood, but gradually all the women joined together. It was led by women, but there were men who joined and were playing a key role in the movement. Asha movement was also nationwide. The core issue was harassment. It was related to dignity. And but interestingly, in some of the other movements, the other was either government or administration or big landlords, police, rangers. In this case, they tried not to have too many others, so they were trying to bring everybody else to their side. So the government they were trying to bring to their sides, the politicians, the administration. So they kind of left the other for them was the harassers. Even the managements they were bringing to their own side. And it started in year 2000, and this was the only movement who kind of reached its conclusion and declared its ending in 2012. A lot of it, not a single protest rally, not a single press conference. A lot of the strategies used in this movement were negotiations and bringing stakeholders on board, all kinds of stakeholders, educators, academicians, lawyers, law enforcing agencies, different government departments. Government was not treated as one. Private sector managements, HR people, those kinds of people. These are private sector, these are chambers of commerce. So those kinds of negotiations. So the biggest ally or institution that sided with them was the parliament, because they wanted legislation against sexual harassment. And the movement started in 2000, and in 2010, 2 bills were passed on sexual harassment, making it a crime not only at workplace but any part of the society, anywhere in the country. Now, again, a short glimpse.
It was not about bashing the government or staging protests, but building alliances and rallying support of the stakeholders, including the government.
The Asha movement led to this change in law, which was a dramatic and a very graphic clarion warning to all males in a male chauvinistic patriarchal society.
It has been moved that bill further to amend the Pakistan Penal Code 1860 and Code of Criminal Procedure 1898, the Criminal Law Amendment Bill 2009 be passed.
इदारा जिसका मैं जिक्र करना चाहूँगा वो वर्किंग वेमन से मुतालिक शहरी तंजीमों के तहत आशा का है, जिसमें डॉक्टर फौजिया सईद की क़यादत में सेक्सुअल हैरेसमेंट जैसे हसास मौजू पर पार्लियामेंट की मामनत और रहनुमाई की। ये कानून साजी के मैदान में पब्लिक प्राइवेट पार्टनरशिप की एक शानदार मिसाल है, और मुझे यकीन है कि सिविल सोसाइटी और पार्लियामेंट के दरमियान ऐसा मुफीद ताउन मुस्तकबिल में भी जारी रहेगा।
And it is a landmark event because this is in fact the very first time that women's activists, members of parliament, and all those who have taken a serious interest in social legislation, particularly that which pertains to the promotion and protection of women, are at a signing ceremony in the presidency. I would like to thank you and invite you, sir, to sign the bill.
Okay. So that movement was slightly different in terms of who they got on their side as opposed to who they were fighting against. Now, putting them together, putting the information and insights together, I want to now focus a little bit on the lessons. And again, I'm overwhelmed with the kinds of conclusions that I do have, but I will try and just identify some, and then you can ask me to dwell upon any if you want in the questions. Now first, when do women take action? When do they come together? When do they join hands? The very obvious answer, and which is also supported by a lot of evidence, is when men disappear. Men go to jail or they die. That is where the vacuum is, and that is where quickly women can come in. But I think that while there is evidence to support that, it is also very simplistic, because women have their own capacity, they have their own attributes, leadership attributes, and it has to do with that also. And when women have opportunity, then there are some women who are more apt to come forward, who have more abilities to mobilize and show the leadership, and that is also an important aspect to know. Also, when it comes to close to their families. So, for example, in the peasant women's movement, there was a young man who died because of the police shooting, and that is when then no woman wanted to stay inside the home. You know, they all wanted to come out because everybody. And when I interviewed a lot of women, they said it could have been my son. So it was just very important for them to come out. Same with fisherfolk, because the police caught some young boys and put them under arrest for fake cases, and that is what women were talking about in the interviews, that this could have been my son. The last point I make here is that when it got too close to their dignity, it was like harassment, physical or sexual abuse, is when they drew their line. And there are times when it was very close to their livelihood issue too, but when I would talk to them, what I could see was that they were very pained about the fact that rangers can just walk into our homes at night, in the middle of the night also, and abuse us, or those kinds of issues. Now, what factors influence them in terms of a positive influence or negative influence, but just collectively, what factors influence them? One is capacity. I think I cannot emphasize that as much as I want to, because every flick of every speck of capacity, which can include reading, speaking two languages, or reading the newspaper, or having some kind of exposure, being out of their village once, being a part of another movement. I mean, that's a big one. But any exposure, even visiting relatives in another city. So I must say that in some of our remote areas, the life for women can be very secluded and very limiting. And therefore, any exposure, even watching television, even having a cell phone, that all adds to the capacity, and that needs to be looked at. Small successes was extremely important, especially when they were narrating their stories, to be able to have a protest rally. When they have this in their mind that nobody can question the authority of the powerful, just to be able to question that and then still live was a very big motivator. And I would give a very quick example, which may not be very relevant, but sometimes women in abusive environment, they stay for 30 years, and one ask the question, why for 30 years? This is a very common analysis and research. It's just that it is very difficult for them to think that there can be another life. And similarly, for people who are really under repressive communities, in, I wouldn't say regimes, but for example, people who were abused by rangers, they could not think that, they almost thought of them as God, so powerful. So small successes were very important. Information technology, information as well as information technology was very important. And the next 3 points are, I think, crucial. It is, and especially the next 2 points are very important for women particularly, not as much for men, I think, but how their family viewed it. Was the family supportive? Because women still operate under the parameter of getting permissions. So did the family allow it, or did they not allow? They probably went ahead and did whatever they wanted to do in any case, but it really had to do, their agency was affected by whether the family was behind them or not. So that was an important point. Similarly, how the society views it. Now, just coming out of the home, speaking loudly, demanding, all these attributes do not match the good woman scenario. So everything that has to do with being a part of a movement or being a part of a protest is already bad, labeled bad in the society. So unless you have family support, unless you have a larger group that buffers you, you are a bad woman. So that stigma. I mean, there were women in these movements whose parents did not like the main lead. A woman who was doing the speech in the fisherfolk movement, her parents did not talk to her for 7 years. Her siblings and parents did not talk to her. Her husband was also one of the main leaders, so she had the support there. But her parents did not talk to her until one of their kids was a victim. And then they realized that what she was working for was a collective good. And then they came and they apologized. But so there are many stories like that. Now, how does state view this whole protest business? Very quickly, the state has a tendency, or even local administration has a tendency of framing the issue as law and order problem. So they frame it and they propagate it like that. So it really influences the agency because they're not the heroes there. Later we can talk about this movement and say, these were the grand leaders and these were the heroes, but at that time they are criminals or they are anti-state troublemakers, or they are breaking law and order. So it is more of that kind of framing. So a lot of times in this movement, except for the Asha movement where they tried to dodge this kind of labeling, it was difficult for them to deal with it. Now, I want to touch the class issue, not going into the detail too much, but I have always been a strong supporter of the fact that when it comes to gender, especially violence against women, class does not matter, because a woman who is raped, doesn't matter if she's rich or she's poor, the pain is the same, the stigma is the same, how she deals with it is the same, the justice system responds to her in the same way. But when it comes to agency, I think it is important to look at the class factor, because women who are more vulnerable in the economic strata, it was more difficult for them to deal with the administration. It was more difficult for them to assert their agency. And women who were from the middle and upper middle class, their social stature helped them to respond and kind of facilitated their agency. Now, again, there is a lot of variation. More age, the better the advantage. If you're married, you have an advantage. If you are happily married, you have an advantage. If you are divorced, then you have a minus. If you are unmarried, you have a big minus. So there is a lot of this gradation that one can go into. Okay, one more point I want to make, that there was also something I want to mention, because outside Pakistan, the image that Pakistani women have is that their movement really was created in 1980s. And that is when women really came out and they were beaten and it was against a dictator. But the reality of the thing is that those were women of middle class. And so they got more attention and they got more publicity. And these health workers, for instance, must have experienced, I would say, very safely, 20 times more violence. But they are not talked about and they're not known outside Pakistan. So the class and the social stature also gives you that advantage of attention. Now, role of other players. That is extremely important. And I must say, even though I'm trying to draw out commonalities, but I do want to acknowledge that every circumstance and every situation is so unique that dynamics differ from situation to situation. So I'm not trying to say that there was a kind of a blanket formula. But role of other players was very important. Media, very quick examples. Media helped almost in every movement. All 4 examples. There is ample evidence that they helped out. But we also have to highlight places where they were not very helpful. The desire or the yearning of media for flamboyant attention getters and a new thing every day and something against the government every day, that yearning or that hunger was coming in the way, and that kind of influenced the agency, because there was one point where the health workers were trying to get media attention, and because they had a hunger strike and every day in and out they were there was nothing new. And so just to get media attention, they said they will burn themselves up tomorrow by this and this date if our demands are not met. They played it safe. If our demands are not met, then we will burn ourselves up. And nobody came to see them. Nobody gave any attention. But by that deadline, the whole media was there to see them burn. And so they got the attention, but that because they didn't get the attention from the politicians, they didn't know whether to burn themselves or not. So actually they carried the oil and the matches, and they got into an embarrassing position. And then one of the leaders, she put oil on herself because she didn't want to die, but that prank didn't work. And then one of the drivers, to save the leader, he burned himself up, and he was saved, but it was just because of that pressure that gets built up that you have to do something to get attention. Now, civil society, I want to again make very few points. In many instances, the well-known civil society leaders, when they came and stood next to these unknown people, groups of people, that gave them, that kind of made their agency stronger. That was very clear. But there were times, if you look closer, there were times that civil society people were kind of playing their politics. They were trying to ride on their success. They were trying to make these big networks and saying, we will have all the people's rights movement come under our fold. So they helped in getting them connected to international players. Then they asked for their price too, because they wanted to sit on the executive committees. In the case of peasant movement, they asked for positions and they said, no, our bylaws say that you have to be a landless peasant to be a part of the committee. And they blackmailed them, these very slick kind of English-speaking activists, and they had already kind of, made them a bit thankful for all the help. And the movement said absolutely no. And then there was a rift, there was a splinter group, and these civil society people kind of sided with them and played the politics. So these kinds of things also happen. They sometimes accentuate the fault lines and get into the power games. Donors, again, a few words about donors. It is very interesting to note that all these 4 movements, which I would consider successful movements or movements that achieved something concrete, were not funded by donors. And if you look at Pakistan, with my 30 years of experience with the activism in Pakistan and civil society, I would say that the funded aspects of our civil society hardly have anything to show, anything concrete to show in Pakistan. So that is a point that needs to be, dwelled upon or think through. The role of donors, there was some small contributions that were made, and I will discuss that when I write it up in more detail, that there were pluses and minuses to that. However, in Asha's case, there were very clear examples of how they undermined the process. So the donors who were putting in money wherever was undermining the process. They were not sensitive to the natural flow of where the larger movement was going. So at one point, ILO funded a parallel bill. So 10 years of work and a national level consensus on one bill, and suddenly a donor started funding a parallel bill, which had to be, curbed and all. So just a few examples. Now, a few words on bureaucracy. I'm just going to flag that and not talk too much about it, that bureaucracy's role was quite negative in all the movements, especially the reactions, how the administration responded. But interestingly enough, I'll just say that, interestingly enough, even after the success of the movement, there was absolutely no accountability for what they did. Even if the health workers are regularized now, and ironically, it was the government that started the program that was, that was actually in power when the movement went to its climax, and water hosing and beating them up, and women losing their children, and it was really violent. But there is no accountability. And also that their salaries were not regularly paid on a monthly basis for 20 years, and there is no accountability. So that's just, I'm just flagging that part. Now this feeling that I had in almost all the movements, that they felt that we sided with men, especially the two where men and women were working together. They sided with men together on their issues, but when it was women's issues, men did not side with them in that strong way. And in both those cases, in the peasant movement and also in the fisher folk movement, both ended up creating an all-women platform. And they did not divorce their movement at all. They're still the women's wing of their movement, but they both separately, independently decided to have their own, because they said that there is no space for our own issues in that joint movement. At this point, I thought I would just highlight that there were many women who said that men were very happy with our achievements. Men were very happy when we were out on the streets. Men were happy with our negotiations. But they themselves could not stand empowered women when it came to our relationship with them directly. And this comment was with husband and wives, and this comment was within colleagues, and they said that they just cannot, even though progressive men and all with us in the movement, but they themselves had a very hard time dealing with empowered women once they're empowered. And my last point, I'm still kind of pulling out my conclusions on that. What has made these movements successful? I think considering the record of movements in Pakistan, I will consider them successful. But I think one is the solidarity, the clarity, the articulation of issue, the clarity of issue, and in a way, simplicity of issue that everybody understood that, yes, we are for it. There was no abstraction about it. I think how the conflicts were managed, that becomes very important, because in 2 cases, the splinter groups were formed and they were handled, they were managed, and they were not able to totally delegitimize the movement. In Asha's case, there was some brewing up, but that was handled. This whole issue of splits is also very important, and movements have to see what splits are happening because of the lack of experience or power dynamics, and what splits are induced by other kinds of security agencies, because there were examples where splits were induced by introducing ethnic divide, Muslim, non-Muslim issue, those kinds of things. So how they handle conflict, I think, mattered a lot. Allies building was extremely important in 2 very successful movements. They were able to bring in the judiciary at a very high level, which was the health workers, and in Asha's case, they brought in the politicians, starting from ground zero to a level where you heard the Prime Minister at the time was praising, and he was saying that this is a sensitive issue, and Asha helped them educate and deal with it. So to that level, starting from zero, where people were laughing and were thinking that, these bad women, they have no respect talking about issue like that, sexual harassment. Starting from there, coming to that level, I think that it was that kind of lobbying and alliance building that helped. I think media also was a key thing. I think intelligent use of lack of resources, that was very important. How to deal with funds, because most of these women were very poor. In case of Asha also, even though the leadership was mostly urban, the membership was very rural and from all villages. So how they contributed and how they shared resources and risk both. Going to jails, getting beaten up. So how they kept themselves together. I think the attention to process was very important. So I'm going to stop here and have you ask me things.
Well, thank you. I imagine I would speak on behalf of everyone else in saying that was a truly fantastic presentation. The way it was structured and organized, and the substance as well was really quite fascinating and well done. I imagine that you'll have questions. I'm going to abuse my moderator status for just a second to pose one initial question to you. And I'll keep it to one. I'm going to go back to the points you were making about the factors influencing collective action, which I thought was particularly interesting. And you had spoken briefly about the role of technology, information technology, in Pakistan. And Pakistan, as you all know, is a poor country. It's an underdeveloped country that lacks many things. But one thing it does not lack is mobile technology, cell phones. I think the figure is something like every other person in the country owns a cellular phone. The question is, do you think, would these movements be as strong and sustained and successful as they have been if these technologies were not available? Related question to that is the role that social media has played in these movements. I mean, in Pakistan, when you think of many different types of movements, you hear about the role of social media, and this is not only something that happens in Pakistan, it happens elsewhere, such as the Middle East. So if you can get to these issues of technology and social media.
I think it definitely helped. In some cases more than the other cases. I think they would have gotten by without it also, but it is certainly a factor that came out that helps agency. In the case of peasant women's movement, they had a few landlines. They did not have cell phones, but a few people in those huge areas, like 10 districts is a lot of area, and hundreds and thousands of people. So every villager by heart remembered the phone numbers of, for example, if 3 homes in a village would have telephone, everybody would know their number and they would share that. And even children, there was one incident where a child was left out. They were all traveling to another city and there was a small kid but he remembered the number and it was not his own number. It was just one house. So in that way, I think sharing whatever they had, sharing of technology was very important. The health workers, I've seen them text all the time. They would not use the phone calls as much because that is expensive. The text is ₹1 a text, so that they would text a lot. But yes, definitely a big help.
All right, let's go to you all. If you could wait until I call on you, until you have a microphone in front of you, because we want people listening to our live webcast to be able to hear you. But if you could state your name and affiliation, please just ask one question. So we'll start over there, the woman. Yeah.
Hello, thank you, Dr. Saeed, for your presentation. My name is Khadija Qamar, and I'm with USAID. My question to you is to talk more about one of the factors you named as having an influence was donor funding. And did you specifically mean foreign donor funding, or did you even also mean local donor funding? Can you also cite some specific examples of how you saw that influencing the local movements? Thank you.
To answer each one.
Yeah, we could start with that.
I can give examples of what kinds of things are more useful than the others. When I meant foreign donors more. The local donors are different kinds of donations. Those are mostly membership donations. We don't have private sector donating to the movements really. So it is when they mobilize membership. But international donors, I think, whatever examples I have seen, they kill social capital very quickly. Because number one, people don't volunteer that often if you have funding. And secondly, the accountability totally shifts from your clientele, which is the members, towards the donors. So you start fulfilling the requirements and making the donor happy rather than making your members happy. So these are two big flaws that I have found why it does not work. I think there are trust levels also that go down. And also I think sensitivity level of the donor. So not knowing the whole scenario before you put in your money has also damaged. What I would recommend very strongly is catalytic funding, where you have little funds for exposure, for training, for helping them do research, to make your argument stronger in communication. Those kinds of linkages, net technology, those kinds of things are very helpful, and they do not play with the power. Cash and money plays with the power dynamics very quickly.
Okay, let's come up here to the front. Sorry, just wait until the mic comes. It's right behind you.
Cynthia Schneider, Georgetown University. Thank you so much, Fouzia. That was so fascinating, and thank you for calling on me because I wanted to follow up on that question. Still on the donor funding. That makes so much sense what you're saying, but now I'm sort of confused, because it seems to me that it is a better idea if the United States is going to give money. Personally, I would much rather have it go to civil society than to the military. But and as I understand it, we've given very large amounts of money to civil society. So can you just parse that a little more? Would you recommend just giving less money altogether and distributing it more widely, or the same amount of money, distributing it better? And are there any best practices? Are there other donors, non-U.S. donors, who get it a little better? And do you see improvements from the U.S. funding?
Okay. Difficult question, but I will try and be candid. I think more money, or big chunks of money, I will be specific, big chunks of money are very damaging, especially when they are poured in without understanding the context, because they build sort of mafias on the block that are not rooted in the mobilization. So you have these artificial players suddenly appear, And these artificial players have more connections internationally, and they go and they get awards and they show their face more on conferences suddenly, and they are not the ones who have kind of brewed up and through a natural process of mobilization. So I think that understanding the context is extremely important, and there is no quick remedy for that. And especially when a donor has people turn out of 1 year, it is kind of not even thinkable to have any good connections. So organizations that have long-term relationship with their partners, they have a long-term, like a staff that stays with them for 10 years and plus, and some NED people are here. I would give a positive example of NED. They do very small amounts of funds. They have long-term relationship. You may take fund or not, the relationship continues. I have a good example of EU. EU has been, because EU doesn't come in on the ground themselves. You know, they stay back and let the partners kind of do however it evolves, the issue evolves. So anybody who comes in and, you know, throws in a block, for example, USAID's project on gender issues, I'll just give a quick example, $40 million, which is a very good recipe to totally kill the civil society. $40 million all poured in one place, because when it was being designed, they do take civil society's point of view. They hardly ever listen to us, but I personally had suggested that you divide it up in 10 million each, give it to the provinces. And at least, you know, you will have some spread, because the provincial civil society never gets to come to these grand receptions in Islamabad, and they hardly speak English. So you divide it up and have 4 hubs, but it was dumped in one place for $40 million, and it has created a lot of mafias. I hope these examples are helpful.
Yes, question over there. Just sorry, wait for the mic. Yeah.
Fouzia, I want to thank you. That was really brilliant, and I think that should put to rest this idea of terribly oppressed Muslim women of Pakistan. They didn't look like oppressed women to me. They were super women. So first of all, thank you so much for bringing that out, and I hope that this particular presentation will be widely circulated so that the abysmal ignorance about the women of Pakistan could be rectified. And I was also going to ask a question about the donors, but you have very well answered that. And I would really request that this go out to all the donors, so that, you know, there's this just as great an ignorance about conditions on the ground. Because while you've highlighted 4 movements, there are myriad movements, and they've not just started in the 80s. From the time of independence, Muslim, you know, women have been out on the streets, and we had Fatma Jinnah, who was the first woman elected in 1962 as president of Pakistan, but the election was stolen. So, you know, we've had amazing women examples of women's movements. So I hope that this would bring this out to the general public, and maybe the donors might be more sensible about what they do with their funds. Thank you.
I just want to add to what you said, and thank you for your comment. I did not talk about the historical overview that I did, because I did start from 1940s, before the partition, and I kind of scanned through very quickly. And I just want to make one point, that every time there was a dictatorship, the person who stood against that dictator was a woman. Starting from Fatma Jinnah against Ayub Khan, she was the only consensus candidate for all the parties, and they chose a woman. And then later Nusrat Bhutto against Yahya Khan, and then Benazir Bhutto against Ziaul Haq, and then against Musharraf Benazir Bhutto. So we have had a tradition of women taking a stand against military and also against militancy.
And just to clarify, you know, it's not just a presentation that you're hearing. This presentation will be a book, and a book that is making very good progress. So you should probably wish that donors will not only hear this presentation, but also read the book when it's available. So, yes.
Hi, I'm Melanie Bixby, U.S. Pakistan Women's Council, and Fouzia is one of our advisors. And I see we have Huzaifa here from the Pakistan Embassy, another advisor, our ambassador and his wife. And here we have Saqib Rizvi of Open, another one of our partners, and Wilson is one of our partners. So this has actually, your research has application to the work of the Women's Council, which is focused in the economic sphere. My question is, what role, and I'm sure it varied as time went on, and I think a greater role is now being played by corporations, both multinationals and the local Pakistani corporations, and how do you see that going forward to empower social movements? For example, the movement that we see to allow more women to finish a secondary school education, go on, get a degree, and to be employed outside the home in the rising middle class.
I think that corporations now have their philanthropy. They have their own units within a corporation that is doing efforts like for education or livelihoods. That part is going well. But I don't think there is a proper bridging between corporations and the movements as such yet. Asha is the only movement out of 4 of them that reached out to employers. And employers became one of the impetus partners, like partners that actually helped out a lot, actively helped out a lot. And that was because after a big communication gap, they were finally able to, Asha was able to bring them on board and say that it helps you. It's not, the law will not be against you, but actually it helps you. So that kind of communication has happened. I'm hoping that the corporate sector will see that as, you can see that the common strand among all the 4 movements was livelihood. So the corporations will be able to see that this opens path towards something that is in their benefit.
It helps their bottom line, and the Pakistan Business Council, for example, to be a member, you must adhere to the Asha legislation.
Yes, yes, they do. They are very active in that.
My name is Farhana, independent researcher. Thank you very much for this nice talk with regard to promotion of women in Pakistan. My question is that how do you measure the success of collective agency in terms of desired outcomes, which are constantly limited by male-dominated society, social norms, set beliefs, institutional structures, and political channels, just to mention a few?
I am seeing it more as a process. I think your question has its answer inbuilt, but I'm looking at it as a process because all these things hamper agency, hamper implementation of results, hamper implementations of achievement. But I'm looking at it more as a process. So where were they and where they are now? That kind of, not an outside measure of success. And because I'm looking at the dynamics and the agency part of it, how they're organizing, how they collectively find solutions. So I have not paid too much attention to measuring that success. I'm looking at these situations as unique circumstances where they have their own dynamics, they have their starting lines, and when I mentioned parameters, I said something concrete. So a raise in pay, making of a law, instituting a policy, and one can continue and see the implementation. But those are all the hurdles. And so one is looking at the process and how best or what is the more effective way of dealing with these hurdles. So it's a complex situation, yes.
I'm going to go all the way to the back. Moeed.
Thanks. Thanks, Michael. Thanks for the presentation. Moeed Yusuf from USIP. So coming at it from a very different angle, not from the subject that you're dealing with, but one that I deal with a lot, which is so this idea of bureaucracy and male patriarchy in a very different context. One, I wonder whether there is room to study the incentive structures for males. So, there's a lot of talk about, you said they can't stand with empowered women and there's a patriarchal, all of that is true. But I find there's not enough conversation of how do you present incentives to those men to stand behind the women while the process is going forward rather than only when it comes out to be a success. So, saying that men don't stand or it's a patriarchal society, we know that. But what are the incentives that can change individually for men? Is there enough work done on that while these movements go forward? And if I can break your rule, Michael, to add 1.5, if not the second question, which is that it actually is a second question, but I also find that one of the reasons bureaucracy and government, not only in Pakistan but generally, can hosepipe and go and take people and detain them and whatever, is that the rules of protests are not well understood. So all laws have certain rules, you can protest here, not do that. You can protest in front of the White House, but if you step here, you won't be able to do it. If you don't have that clarity, states have much more space to come after you by saying, well, you're violating this law or that law. Is there also space to educate these women or any movements, quite frankly, non-violent movements, on what their rights are as they approach this? Thanks.
Thank you. Very good questions. I think that first I want to clarify that men did not join them when they became successful. In 2 of the cases, men initiated and women joined the men. In Asha's case, women initiated and men joined. In health worker cases, women were leading because they were larger in number, and then they had accountants and drivers also part of the project staff, so they joined. So they were a minority. I would say the biggest incentives that I have studied in movements are joint objectives. Starting from Qaid-e-Azam, when Muslim League did not win the seats in what is now Pakistan, there was he encouraged women, especially from the families of the Muslim Leaguers, to mobilize women, politicize women, get them out to vote. So it was a joint objective, and that opened up space for women to become politicized. It is social objectives at times, when, for example, maybe in Afghanistan, I'll give an example, when the government wanted to portray that we disassociate from Taliban and portray that we are more progressive, then suddenly that space was created where the burqa was not necessary in the city, which was not that common, but still it was, scarf was encouraged more to kind of show that we are progressive people. So there is space that gets created because there are joint incentives or motivation. And I can give you many. Votes is one, economics is another one, livelihood is another one, facing the police is another one, just showing the numbers, the strengths on the street is another one. All these labor unions, they love to have these women wings, and get them out in the rallies, especially when there is a huge number of police outside. They want their women to actually be in the front. So those are the kinds of incentives that they would have to join the struggles. But your second question, I would say, I think Asha among these movements was one movement that got to those advanced levels of knowing what are our rights, and actually knowing the parliamentary procedures many a times more than the parliamentarians. Bureaucratic regulations more than the bureaucrats, and the motto was we have to stay 3 steps ahead of them. So we were playing with rules that they did not even know of. And I think that there are examples of that. And I think that is the level where towards which civil society has to work. And that is why I presented Asha at the end, because not a bone broken, none of us went to jail. And at the end, we got so much praise from the people that we wanted the action from, from the president and the prime minister. And the senior politicians, they were also clapping. So it was really playing the game by the rules and actually playing the rules and finding the spaces of doing it, being smart enough kind.
Okay, other questions? All the way at the front, in fact.
Thanks, Michael. Fouzia, it's been terrific having you here. You're about to leave us, and we'll miss you. I've had the good luck of reading a number of your chapters, and it's going to be a really good book. So I'm delighted that others share my desire to see your findings widely circulated. I have a question about your choice of your 4 movements. Why these 4? What were some of the options that you might have written about instead of? Did you choose these 4 because they are uniquely successful? Did you choose these 4 because they're representative of a larger group that you might equally have written about? What was your strategy which dictated your choice of these particular movements?
I did consider others, 3, 4 others, and I did collect data on those also. But then I decided not to include them. For example, I looked at the nurses movement, and nurses movement has a whole background. They organized in 1940s, and then there was a whole, and at that time, the government did not allow them to marry. You know, at that time, there was a tradition that nurses could not be married. And so they fought for the right to get married and have a family. They fought for the right to change their uniform, which was very Western looking, you know, from the colonial days. They fought for many things. And then there was a new wave of young nurses who has been out on the streets in the last 5 years. So I was very intrigued by them, and I looked at them. I did not choose them because I think in these movements, I thought it will be easier for me to look at the whole process. And they have spent like 10 years, and I can study the dynamics of agency better, because those were, this last wave was very quick, like about a year old. Then I studied power loom movements, which is, we have a textile industry in central Punjab, and there are a lot of textile workers, and women are employed there in huge numbers. So it was a joint movement of men and women, but women again took over the offices when male leadership was taken away. So I looked at that also, but there also I felt like women were, it was not their choice as much as it was men pushing them, you know, to go ahead and fill up the space and kind of be a buffer between. So there were reasons. I also looked at the labor movements, because there again we have a history of women being active. But again there I did not see the kind of leadership I saw in these so clearly. So I felt studying, because I was focusing on the agency, I can see the patterns more clearly where I have clearer women's leadership. And I have a long period of time where I can actually get the rhythm of the movement and see how they dealt with conflict, how they dealt with success, how they dealt with police violence, how they dealt with resources, etc. So I had a longer period of time.
Okay, yes.
Hi, my name is Amy Kalfis. I work for the U.S. Institute of Peace as well. First of all, thank you for your presentation. It was very insightful. Many of the women's activists that I've spoken to from Pakistan have highlighted an intergenerational gap between younger activists and older activists who have been working on these issues for quite some time. So to what extent did you see this age gap in your work? And just quickly, countering violent extremism has really become the new catchphrase here in DC. So what extent have you seen women in Pakistan engaged in this space? And are there any movements in particular that you see as gaining momentum, especially with the younger generation?
Okay. I think for these 4 movements, I felt like there was no gap in the generations, because these movements were so comprehensive in their areas. So in the peasants movement, even a small child would know the slogan and would really chant the slogan, either death, ownership of land, or death. So it was well, everybody believed in those objectives. But that is a very real problem, what you're talking about. That is more pertaining to the urban areas. Because of the kind of Islamization we have experienced, and because of the ideological narrative that has seeped into our society, the urban youth is more affected than the rural youth. And I think it is there where we get frustrated from the younger lot, and we feel like we are more political than our younger students. Besides the universities, which were the hubs, there are no training grounds for young people. The universities, there is no political activity. They have to sign a contract that they will not be involved in any political activity, whereas that used to be our training ground. There are no cafes and hubs that used to be there. There used to be journalists newspaper offices that were hubs. That is where people learned their politics, and they got depoliticized. So a lot of those training grounds have disappeared.
Okay, let's go to the back over there. Other direct. Oh, yeah.
Jan Kalitsky, that's an excellent presentation. I wonder whether you could tell us a little bit more about the ebb and flow of these movements. Often movements achieve certain objectives, as Asha did, and then they become less active following the achievement of that objective. Do you see that as a challenge, and or is there a case of continued effort? Because obviously in all of these areas, including the sexual discrimination and the like, there's an agenda that has to be pursued.
I can talk about all four movements. The health worker movement continues because the implementation has not happened yet, so they're still very active. They give a time period to the government, then they come on the streets again, so they go in cycles. The peasant movement continues, but they are quite prosperous now because they don't share anything with the government since 2004. So suddenly there are schools, suddenly there are jobs, suddenly that you can recognize that area because now there is money there. But the movement continues because things have changed in certain areas, but there are still places where they are pushed to give their crop. So they are catching on. In terms of Asha, Asha announced this very clearly that they will end the movement because at that time we believed that movements should be ended when they achieve their objectives, because sometimes movements turn into bureaucratic elephants, institutions, and then they ask for funds, and then they want permanency, then they become fatter and fatter. So we didn't want to fall in that trap, because suddenly after the success, a lot of donors ran towards us with a lot of money, and we wanted to avoid that trap. Sometimes, emergency relief thing can turn into an institution. So at that point, my team had this clear idea that we should remain movements, and once it's achieved, it should end. Also, sometimes it comes in the way of implementation, but that's very peculiar to a certain situation. For example, Asha had become so credible that the provincial governments were not taking on the responsibilities they should have taken. So what we did was that we created another implementation forum where government took the lead, and we kind of distributed ourselves and sat in those committees as civil society people just to kind of keep an eye, and continued with the same momentum, the implementation, but with different hats. And as such, the movement closed down. So I think those are decisions that people have to make depending on circumstances.
Fouzia, thanks for a great presentation. And again, congratulations for all the work that you've done with Asha. I just have a question on the bills and the legislation that resulted from the Asha movement. You said that there were 2 that were passed before 2010, and maybe there were several others that took place toward the end of the movement. How did maybe the public-private partnership help to ensure a level of transparency and accountability when it came to enforcing, the outcome of the bills that spoke towards sexual harassment? Have the statistics been any different from before?
I think on the basis of the experience that we had with the government and the parliamentarians, we were quickly able to strategize and chalk out a path for implementation, and the government went along. So we had a national level implementation watch committee, then we had provincial level committees, implementation committees, where private sector and civil society, media, government, they work together. And in that, just to give you quick statistics, in the first 1 year, we had about 1,000 cases that were filed. And by now, there are about 4,500 cases that I'm aware of. But there would be many more because they're not supposed to report every case. So the process is going on. I am satisfied with the process. It requires a push, like 24/7 kind of a push. You cannot be satisfied because it's not just the implementation part. There are a lot more complex dynamics. For example, now that it is pinching on certain people, they want amendments and they want to pull the teeth out of the law, and so one has to constantly, have a little sword in your hand and you fight out whatever attempts to undermine the law, etc., etc. So the process goes on.
Yes.
Hi, I'm Xerxes Spencer with the National Endowment for Democracy. And yesterday at our organization, you screened a terrific film showcasing Pakistan's long-standing history of religious, ethnic, cultural pluralism. And I wanted to ask you today, to what extent do the movements that you studied reflect that rich cultural, religious, and ethnic pluralism? Or put another way, to what extent do religious or ethnic minorities participate in these women's movements? Are these primarily all Muslim women's movements, or do you see Christians and Hindus and Sikhs and other minorities participating in these movements? Thank you.
I think that's a very important aspect of these movements. In the peasant women movement, that area is dominated by Christians, or some parts of central Punjab. So main leadership was Christian, but then eventually the splinter group was more Muslim. I think it is 40-60 kind of a divide in certain areas. So that was a very mixed kind of a movement, and those people got along very well because they were very used to living together. But when I mentioned these induced splits, so that I believe, now I do not have enough evidence, but I believe that kind of a split was induced where these issues of Christianity, Muslim, non-Muslim, they were induced and on both sides, and it accentuated the split. In Asha movement, there was a very conscious effort of including everybody. So there were a lot of Hindus and Christians involved in that. Health workers, because that was by profession. So whoever was of whatever religion was a part of it. Fisher folk also had a combination because it was all Sindh and all the coastal areas. So there the point of solidarity was more the profession. But there was a mix there.
Well, I think that we have about 40 people in this room right now that are eagerly awaiting this book when it comes out, which will, of course, be addressing the themes and others that you've heard today. Again, I thought this was a terrific presentation, also a terrific discussion. So thank you to all of you. If you could join me in another round of applause for Fouzia Saeed. Thank you very much for coming. We're adjourned.